the topic of tonight's webinar is going to be how to prepare for a practical test. So again, I was talking about earlier, the last couple webinars have been just very lesson based on ACS content or different private pilot material. So we'll just kind of go over the checkride itself today. So just as a brief introduction, my name is Wesley Chin. I'm a CFI at Princeton Flying School. I've been teaching here for about a year so far. I also did all my ratings and certificates at Princeton from private to CFI. So I'm currently in my third year at the Rutgers Business School studying finance, and my other big passion is music, so I play saxophone and piano as well. All right, so contents for today, we're going to start off with the outline of a practical test, a very brief one actually. I don't know if you guys know, but the webinar for next month, November, is actually going to be done by a guy named John Beck, who is actually a designated pilot examiner. He's going to be possibly the one giving you your checkride. He's going to be going over the anatomy of a practical test, so he'll have more detail on all that. So we'll just kind of go over briefly what the practical test is going to cover. And then we'll go over what will be asked, and we'll talk about different resources and documents that you should be familiar with, what to check out in each one. And then the last section, not super organized, but just additional tips and tricks that I think will be helpful for all you guys to know for your check rides. All right, so we'll begin with the outline of a practical test. So some people use the phrase practical test, but it's the exact same thing as a check ride, kind of more unofficial term. But you can think of it as an end of course final exam. So after you complete all of your training, you've got all the necessary hours, you've done your solo time, cross country, all that stuff, written exam, medical. You take this check ride, and it's conducted by an FAA designated pilot examiner. We usually call that a DPE. So they may fly to you, you have to go to them possibly, and they give you this whole test just to see if you know your stuff, and if you do, you would get that certificate you've been applying for. There really shouldn't be any surprises on a check ride because everything they can ask you, and including the standards, are found in this document called the Airmen Certification Standards. That's the ACS. So we're going to go over that in more detail later on, but that's going to be probably the most important document to be familiar with a check ride. So for the outline of a practical test, we can kind of break this down into two parts. The first part is an oral exam, usually lasting maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then after that is going to be a flight portion where you and the examiner would actually go flying. So for the oral exam, it's going to start off with, we can call it maybe check ride qualification. So you're going to sit down with the examiner on the ground, and he's basically going to go over to determine if you're actually eligible to take this test or not. So he's going to go over your logbook and your IACRA application, and we'll talk about what that is later, just to make sure you've got all the necessary flight hours. You've got the documentation, including the instructor endorsements in your logbook. You've completed and passed a written exam, got your medical, student pilot certificate and all that, examiner fee and everything. But the place to find if you're actually okay to take this test or not is going to be the regulations, of course. And 61103, that's the place to find eligibility requirements for the private pilot, subpart E here. So if we check it out, it says, first part A is be at least 17 years of age for a rating and other than a glider balloon. And since I think all of us here are going for airplane, should be good. Talking about understanding English there, pretty important. Next couple of sections are on endorsements, knowledge test, and then G over here is meet the aeronautical experience requirements of this part. So if I go back to subpart E for private pilot aeronautical experience, which is 61109 over here, subpart A details everything you need to do before you take that check ride. So some of you guys may be familiar with this. You've got to have that at least 40 hours of flight time. That includes at least 20 hours of flight training from an authorized instructor. You've got to have 10 hours of solo flight training. All of this stuff in here, or whatever rating or certificate you're applying for, you have to make sure you check those regulations, and maybe even during the training, just check these off as you go, just to make sure those are all done beforehand. So once the examiner determines that you're good to take the test, then the oral questioning will start. And he's just basically going to ask you a lot of scenario-based questions to see if you actually know what you're talking about and you have the skills and knowledge necessary to safely operate an airplane by yourself. So topics could include airworthiness requirements, cross-country flight planning, weather information and theory, and a lot of other things. It's all found in that ACS document, which we're going to talk about soon. But before you even start this check ride, usually what's going to happen is when you reach out to that examiner, you're going to get a cross-country flight plan assignment. So he's going to say, hey, plan a flight to Salisbury, Maryland. My weight is X amount of pounds. So you would have to do weight and balance. You would have to do a cross-country flight plan and navigation log, and you would have to bring that to your oral exam. And then during the oral exam, a lot of the questions that he's going to ask you is going to be based around that situation. So it's not going to be like a knowledge test where it's just rote memorization in some sense. It's being able to apply that knowledge to a scenario. So once that's done, though, you would go for the flight portion, and this is where you would fly with the examiner. He's going to evaluate your skills on some takeoff and landings, performance maneuvers, steep turns, for example, if you're going for commercial, lazy A's, chandela, stuff like that, and ground reference maneuvers such as S-turns, turns around a point. And again, all of this is detailed in that Airman Certification Standards ACS document that we'll go over later. But basically for the flight portion, you'll start off with the departure, and you fly maybe the first leg of that cross-country flight plan that he asked you to do. And after that, you'll divert. You may land, you may not, but then you would go to do some other maneuvers, and you go back to the airport, try a couple more takeoff and landings, and that's usually the flight portion there. So outcomes of the practical test after you finish that. The first thing, obviously most desired, is the temporary airman certificate. So if your performance is satisfactory on your check ride, you would pass and you would get that temporary or private pilot certificate, in this case, piece of paper. And later on, they would mail you a plastic card that would be permanent there. Second outcome here is the notice of disapproval. So let's say during your check ride, your steep turns, for example, you get a little bit too low, maybe you lose 250 feet, which is out of standards according to the ACS. And because of that, the examiner has to issue a notice of disapproval. And basically what you would do after that is you would go back to your instructor, get retraining on that specific item, and you can retake the check ride within 60 days and just do that specific item. So we'll talk about that more in detail later. And then the last outcome here is probably the one that's most confusing. It's called the letter of discontinuance. So a good example is, let's say you have done your oral exam already and you're ready to go flying, but you check the METAR, it's like broken at 1,200 feet. You being a good pilot will know that, okay, it's probably not the best thing if I want to go do stalls on a check ride right now. It's not good to fly. So you can ask the examiner to discontinue the practical test. So you would get that letter of discontinuance, and then you have 60 days to come back with that examiner and finish up the rest of the check ride, whatever has to be completed there. And again, you, the applicant, can discontinue at any time during the test. Another example, I don't know if this could happen. Maybe you do your oral exam, you have a break for lunch, you get food poisoning or whatever, you're not feeling too good, you're not going to go fly the airplane for your check ride, so you can discontinue. But you can't discontinue to cover up a disapproval, for example. So if you are doing your steep turn, notice getting a little bit low, you lose 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet, you can't just say, hey, I want to discontinue my check ride right now. The examiner will know that trying to cover up some kind of failure there. So what do you need to bring to a practical test, though? You do want to come prepared with a lot of different things, and fortunately the FAA does kind of hand out or give you this nice handy dandy list of stuff to have. This is found in that Airman Certification Standards document, which we'll take a look at. It says practical test checklist for the applicant, and it starts with the acceptable aircraft. So first you have to make sure that the aircraft has all its documents. So that's Aero over there. Have all your maintenance records, so the logbook of inspections, AD, noise compliance, and the POH as well. And then under the personal equipment, view limiting device, just another word for foggles or hoods, which you're going to be using for instrument maneuvering during the flight portion there. Current aeronautical charts, so sectional. And note how it says printed or electronic. I'd recommend bringing both just as a backup. Next, you have computer and plotter, so flight computer, E6B or CX3, and then your plotter, which probably won't have to use, but good idea to have that. And then flight plan form and flight logs, again, printed or electronic, just because that examiner is going to ask you to plan a cross-country scenario, so you do want to have the flight log filled out prior to your check ride going into it. And then charts, supplements, airport diagrams, and appropriate publications. So you may need to refer to those materials during the check ride and oral at least, so it's a good idea to have that in addition to the FAR aim for your regulations there. Now, personal records, a whole lot of stuff too. So photo ID, driver's license can work there, passport. Got to have your pilot certificate, and if you're applying for a private, then you want to make sure you bring your student pilot certificate with you. And then a current medical certificate. And then the fourth one here, a little confusing. It says completed FAA Form 8710-1 or completed IACRA form. So before you even schedule this check ride, you would have to sit down with your instructor and go online to this IACRA website and complete an online application where you fill out information about yourself, including your flight hours and experience, to determine that you're actually okay to take this test. And after you finish that application, your instructor will sign it off and you'll receive what's called an FTN number. I think that's flight tracking number. That number, if you give that to the examiner, he can pull up all that information so he can check that you've got all the hours and everything. So the IACRA form does have to be completed before the check ride, and it's a good idea to have that FTN number as well with you. Next thing is your knowledge test report. This thing here says original Airman knowledge test report. I'm not sure if I believe something changed with that, where you can just print out a new one. But as long as I believe at least it's showing that you pass and you have your instructor endorsement, then you're good there. Which leads me to the next bullet point: pilot logbook. So you've got all your flight hours in there and the appropriate instructor endorsements, which your instructor will give you before your check ride. And then the last four things here, you may or may not need. So notice of disapproval, you would only need that if you're coming back to just finish up maybe something that you didn't pass on before. The letter of discontinuance, of course, like we talked about, maybe the weather was bad, so you come back just for the flight portion. Approved school graduation certificate. None of us here at Princeton have to worry about that. It's more Part 1 to 41 stuff. And then evaluator's fee. That is something to worry about here. So when you go for this check ride, when you contact that examiner, he or she is at least going to give you that cross-country information, the weight and balance, but he's also going to tell you how much money he wants. So make sure that you bring that evaluator fee, because you forget that, you're probably not going to want to continue that check ride there. So we will go into scheduling a check ride now. I don't know if anybody gets this little graphic here on the left side, but if you end up taking your check ride with J Auslander, you will get that. So the easiest way for us at least to schedule a check ride is, again, just contact a local designated pilot examiner. We have a list here at the school. And when you do that, again, they're going to give you, or at least you'll agree upon, a test date and a time, a location. And the reason why I say location, some DPEs will not come to Princeton to do your check ride. So for example, if you want to take your check ride with Bill Wheaton, he's probably going to have you fly out to Ocean County, MJX, to do your check ride over there. Examiner fee, like we talked about, the cross-country flight plan, weight and balance, any performance charts, scenarios that he's looking for, he's all going to give that to you when you contact him. You should have that ready for the check ride there. Some additional things to consider here when you schedule a check ride. Work schedule. So a lot of you guys are busy people, got other stuff going on, and flying is not the #1 thing in your life. So probably don't want to schedule a check ride before or after a long day of work, because usually it will be around 4 to 5 hours for the whole thing. Oral exam is maybe 2 hours, so flight is 1.5 to 2 hours with a break in the middle. So do plan on it being kind of a lengthy thing, and it's important to be ready for that. Something else is airplane availability. So if you're going to schedule a check ride, before you actually confirm the date, please make sure that you check your Flight Schedule Pro or whatever system you use to determine if your airplane that you're looking for is actually available. And if you're scheduling a test date far out, don't slack on your studying, because let's say, what is it today, the 12th of October, and you have your check ride just scheduled for February 10. It's a good chance you're going to forget a lot of the information if you study now and you don't touch it for the next couple months. So make sure that you at least try to equally space out your studying so you're not forgetting things at the last second there. All right, so we'll go into the content, at least, of a practical test now, and kind of different documents and resources that are really important. So the first thing, and I've been repeating this a couple times so far, the Airmen Certification Standards, ACS. This is the key document you have to be familiar with for the check ride. It's going to list out anything they can possibly ask you, notes on where to find the stuff, skills with standards as well. And this quote here is pretty much the first sentence in the introduction here. It says, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, has published the Private Pilot ACS document to communicate the aeronautical knowledge, risk management, and flight proficiency standards for the private pilot certification in the airplane category, single engine land. So they're literally telling you, this is not open notes per se, but this is your study guide. We've got everything laid out, exactly what you need to know. So there's no surprises on the check ride. So we're going to open this up here and take a look at what the ACS is going to contain. All right, so Private Pilot Airplane Airman Certification Standards. I think the last revision is June 2018. All right, and the forward here, this is that first thing we're just looking at, that first sentence. And we're going to go find the table of contents here. Okay. So the first page is an intro. They talk about what the ACS is and also how to use the ACS. I would recommend going through that, just maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then once we go through that, we're going to come back up to the table of contents, go over each one of these, what these sections are at least. All right, so ACS concept says the goal of the Airman certification process is to ensure the applicant possesses the knowledge, ability to manage risks, and skill consistent with the privileges of the certificate or rating being exercised in order to act as PIC. So the whole point is they have to test you to determine if you can safely act as pilot in command as a private pilot. And how to use the ACS over here. There's a lot of different terms and words that we saw before, but we're going to go over that now. So the ACS consists of a couple of things called areas of operation arranged in a logical sequence. Starts out with pre-flight preparation and ends with post-flight procedures. And in the middle, you would have takeoffs and different maneuvers and then landings and stuff like that. And we're going to go back before. And under each area of operation, there's going to be different tasks that are related to the area of operation. So for example, one of the areas of operation is takeoffs, landings, and go-arounds. And a couple of the tasks in that area of operation are short field landing, soft field landing, for example. And each task is going to have its own page. It's going to have an objective stating exactly what you have to know. It'll list the knowledge, the risk management, the skill elements, and even references and notes to where to find that stuff. So if we go back to that table of contents, I'll show you guys here. So pre-flight preparation right here. This is area of operation 1. And there's a bunch of these different tasks below pre-flight preparation. So task A is pilot qualifications. Task B is airworthiness certificates. Let's go to another one here. Performance and ground reference maneuvers is area of operation 5. Task A is steep turns. So let's go to steep turns and check this out. Here's your page for the steep turns task. Here are the references for the materials here, and the objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with steep turns. Here's the knowledge that you have to know. You have to demonstrate the understanding of purpose of steep turns, aerodynamics associated with steep turns to include coordinated and uncoordinated flight, overbanking tendencies, all this stuff here. And then for risk management, they also test on this, and this is a huge emphasis nowadays too. You've got to be able to understand failure to divide attention between airplane control and orientation, or collision hazards, making sure you're also looking outside when doing the steep turn. And then the skills here will denote exactly what you're going to do in the airplane. You have to demonstrate the ability to, very important, clear the area. So remember your clearing turns there, it tells you that. You've got to establish your proper airspeed, roll into a coordinated 360-degree steep turn with approximately a 45-degree bank. The last thing here, your standards. It says maintain the entry altitude plus or minus 100 feet, airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, bank plus or minus 5 degrees, and roll out on the entry heading plus or minus 10 degrees. So this literally gives you everything you need for the steep turn. It's up to you to know this information and then practice it enough so that you can perform steep turns up to these standards here. So that's how the ACS is going to work. So these are the maneuvers. And then that area of operation 1, which was the pre-flight preparation, that's all the stuff they're going to ask during the oral exam. So it's going to start off here with task A, which is pilot qualifications, then it goes on all the way. So this is definitely probably the most important document for you to go through. I definitely recommend honestly making a study guide using this because each individual bullet point tells you exactly what you need to know. This is what the examiner is going to test out of. So as long as you meet the standards here, you're going to be good. And if you know the information here, you're going to be good. All right, so that's the ACS here. So let's talk about a couple of different other resources and tools you're going to need for the check ride. So you also have to make sure that your airplane is ready to go for that check ride. And that means your inspections have been complete. So if you guys know Aviated, that's the acronym we can use for our inspections. So very important for that check ride, you should sit down with your instructor and go through your airplane's logbooks to determine that all of these inspections have been completed. So I would go down through Aviated, tab the annual inspection, tab your 100-hour, all that other stuff, so that during the oral exam, you're ready to show that. Because one of the things in that ACS is that you have to be able to understand the required inspections and airplane logbook documentation. So we go back to the ACS right over here, actually, task B is airworthiness. Skills, the applicant demonstrates the ability to locate and describe airplane airworthiness and determine the airplane is airworthy in a scenario given by the evaluator. So he's basically going to ask you, pull open the logs, show me that the airplane is airworthy for a flight today, and you've got to be able to, point to Aviated. It is a good idea to, again, go through this at least once before your check ride and not during your oral exam, because these are kind of important documents when you first look at them. It may be a little confusing, so your instructor will help you figure out, what exactly you're looking at for the inspections there. So in addition to making sure the airplane is good to fly, you've also got to know your airplane pretty well. And the main resource for that, of course, is the pilot's operating handbook for your specific airplane there. This handbook is broken down into many different sections. This is definitely a cover-to-cover read. So you've got systems, which is section 7. You want to know your V speeds, know all the different instruments and avionics in the airplane. You've got to be able to use all the different performance tables and charts in section 5, and how to calculate weight and balance in different scenarios, which is in section 6. And of course, the normal and emergency procedures are your checklist items. And emergency procedures, stuff in boldface at least should be memorized. I think that's section 3 and 4. So definitely make sure you know your POH, and this is something you will have with you as well during the check ride. Regulations is also another big thing here. If you guys know this book, it's a pretty big book. You're not going to be expected to know every single regulation in that firing book. However, at least for this ASA edition over here, they include this, I don't know what it's called, like a suggested study guide list for each certificate in the beginning of the book. So if you pull that open and look at the first couple of pages, it'll say suggested study guide list, and it'll list out sport pilot, recreational, or private, and all that. So if you look at the private pilot, it'll list out, I'm not sure, maybe I'll call it 20 to 40 different regulations. It'll say 61-103, 91-205, etc. And those are the regulations that you want to pay attention to. So this is not something you want to be reading cover to cover. You do want to go to that suggested study guide list, use that to help you figure out the proper regulations to know and understand, and also tab them so that you can refer to them later on, even during that check ride if you need to there. So that's pretty important. So with the ACS, we went over how it gives you all these different bullet points of the knowledge to know, right? It gives you knowledge, risk management, and skills. But the only problem is during the oral exam, that's all about questions. This thing does not give you any possible questions about what they can ask. That's where the oral exam guide can come in handy. So ASA publishes oral exam guides for, I think, pretty much all the certificates, private, instrument, commercial, and all that. The private pilot one is this blue book over here, comes with the ground school kit. This is probably the second most important document, I would say. And you want to use both the ACS and the oral exam guide to help you prepare for the oral exam. So I'd recommend first going through the ACS, make sure you use that as a study guide, know everything there, and then you can go through the oral exam guide. That's actually mirroring the ACS. So it starts off with chapter 1 is pre-flight preparation, then it follows the ACS areas operation, and it'll give you questions related to each task. So study the material first, then go into the oral exam guide to see if you can actually answer those questions. And if you can't, they describe everything, including references. So these are the two probably most important things to get you ready for the oral there. So everything we've talked about so far has had to do with the oral, right? But the flight portion, again, standards and everything you need to know is going to be found in the ACS, like we talked about. So it's going to show exactly what maneuvers and skills that are going to be tested in the airplane and the standards that are going to be held to. And this is what we were just looking at with the steep turns before with the standards. And everything else, you'll have the same thing. So I'll score to something random here. Power on stalls, right? There's the task. It tells you the knowledge, the risk management, and then the skills. It says clear the area, select an entry altitude that will allow the task to be completed no lower than 1,500 feet. And again, all these different standards about heading and bank angles. So he's super familiar with this stuff here. He's likely not going to ask you on the check ride, hey, tell me the standards for bank angle on steep turns. But you should know those pretty well if you want to pass the check ride. You want to make sure that the maneuvers you're performing are within those standards there. Another common misconception here with these maneuvers and tasks in the airplane. You do not have multiple shots to complete it during the check ride. You actually only have one shot. So let's say if the examiner tells you, all right, let's do steep turns, and you go into the steep turns, but you fall outside of the ACS standards, you can't repeat it again. And you would actually have to, but that would actually count as a disapproval, and you would have to come back and do that again. So you do only have one shot to do each maneuver, and it has to be within the ACS standard. So it's pretty important, again, that you're able to practice enough with your instructor and get it up to these standards. All right, so that's the end of the documents and resources here. So we'll go into just some miscellaneous tips and tricks that I've gotten throughout the years and from others. I think this should be helpful as well for check rides. So first thing, I am safe. What is that? Does anybody know what I am safe is?
Health.
Health. All right, there you go. So pilot self-assessment, basically. You have to be checking for its illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion, and also eating. And every time before you go fly an airplane or go for your flight lesson, you should be going through that. Please remember that I am safe is also going to apply to your check ride. If you're sick the night before, reschedule that check ride because you know your performance is not going to be that good. Stress is probably the one that's a little different with this. It's healthy to have a good amount of stress, but if you're really, really stressed out, cramming the night before, not getting enough sleep, pulling an all-nighter before a check ride, not a good idea there either. Second thing, use that practical test checklist to make sure you bring everything you need on the day of your test. I've seen a lot of people go to their check ride and they forget something simple. Maybe they forget their medical cert at home. They don't have one of the endorsements or they don't meet the eligibility requirements, anything like that. Do you use that practical test checklist? Check those things off literally just to make sure on the day of you have everything with you. Another good idea is to arrive early. If you're doing it at Princeton, just get there early, but if you have to fly somewhere, make sure you're getting there early too. For example, you may need to do a new weather briefing. Weather has changed and you have to re-input those values for your new nav log. Or you have to take a different airplane at the last second and you're not sure about the inspections. Maybe you're scheduled an 8 Mike Charlie and at the last second you have to take your check ride in 2 Fox Whiskey, then you want to double check that your inspections again are all good and the airplane is legal to fly. So kind of connecting to bring those reference materials to the check ride. You have to make sure everything you bring to the check ride, being the FAR aim, chart supplement, sectional, all those materials have to be current and up to date. So that's one of your responsibilities as a pilot, to maintain a current library of information. So if you walk into the check ride and you put your 2019 sectional and 2019 FAR aim on table, it's not going to cut it right there. So make sure that you have all up-to-date material so you can refer to that on your check ride there. Kind of going on to what we were talking about before. Set up early and be able to pick a quiet location. This is from my CFI check ride that I did. This is in our classroom upstairs. I think if you take it with John Beck, he does it in the sim room. But basically what I have here, and what I would also suggest if you have the opportunity to do this, set up all those documents for the examiner where he's going to sit. So in that folder, I have my written test reports. I have my medical there. There's my logbook, my pilot logbook tab with where I've got those requirements done and the endorsements. Got photo ID, pilot certificates, and then in that envelope, I have his evaluator fee, which he's going to like to see there. So definitely make sure that you can set it up, get organized. That's going to make a really good impression at first. Another big one, treat your oral exam like a conversation rather than intense questioning. He's not going to open up that oral exam guide and just pick out certain questions and ask you and expect to answer. Remember that everything is going to be based around the situation, that cross-country flight plan. He's going to start with making sure, is the airplane good to go? Then you go into the weather. Is the weather good? Then you go into your cross-country flight planning. All that stuff is situation-based. So you do want to treat it more like a conversation. And he's going to make it like a conversation too. It's not going to be just intense firing with questions there. And another big thing that can cause people to have a disapproval is only answer what is being asked. Even if you really know your stuff, again, only answer what is being asked. So if he or she asks you, is supplemental oxygen required for our flight today at our cruising altitude of 4,500 feet? All you have to say is no. Do not go on to explain that, what is it, 12,500 feet, you need supplemental oxygen for room flight crew. None of that. Just answer whatever's being asked, and that'll be it. Because if you try to include something else and you're not too confident on the material, the DP will probably start asking additional questions on that, and you're going to dig yourself into a hole. So make sure you try to answer only what's being asked in a brief and concise manner, just whatever gets to the point there. So there's a lot of stuff when you go for a check ride. You're not going to be expected to memorize every single thing in the ACS. I'll say that right there. That's pretty hard to do that. So it's okay to pull out reference materials such as checklists, POH, FAR aim. Any of those things are okay to pull out during your check ride. But it's important that you are familiar with at least where the information is in those materials. So if you have a FAR aim, make sure that you know how to go through that. And again, that's why I was talking about tab that up beforehand. You don't want to just pull it out of the shrink wrap, make it nice and new for the check ride, that's not going to be looking good for that examiner. So make sure that, again, that you're familiar with where to find the stuff if you don't know something. And again, if you don't know anything, you can't just open up the PHAC or FAR AIM for every single question and to, flip to different pages. That's not going to cut it there. So if you don't know something, which will happen, you're not going to be expected to know every single question during the check ride. Do not try to make it up. Just tell them you don't know the answer, but ask if, again, you can use one of your reference materials to find that answer. Because, again, that's why it's really important. Know those reference materials and books inside out, is you may need to refer to them during that check ride. But definitely do not try to make it up or BS. The examiner will be able to detect that right away, and then he will start asking additional questions, and again, you'll dig yourself into a bigger hole. So please make sure, if you don't know something, that's okay. Just tell them, I don't know the answer, but you know where to find it. That's going to be the key there. So after the oral exam is going to be finished, you're going to be directed to start pre-flighting the airplane. Do expect that the examiner is going to watch the pre-flight here. Very important. A lot of people, when they do their pre-flight, kind of get lazy and we don't use a checklist, and we just go around the airplane, check the things that we know to check, and we go on the airplane and get started. On your check ride, please do not do that. You should always be using a checklist when you pre-flight the airplane. Don't skip any items. Use that checklist. I know we're not actually flying yet, but this is still the check ride, because not using checklists and forgetting something super simple like a tie down or a chalk, great way to stop that check ride before you're beginning the flight. So make sure before the flight, use that checklist. And during the flight, always use your checklist. Do not skip anything. Even if you have an after landing flow, flaps up, lights, whatever it is, still use that checklist. The examiner is going to want to know exactly what you're doing there. So during the flight portion, the examiner is going to test you on those maneuvers, right? He's going to say, okay, let's start off with some slow flight. But what he's not going to do is he's going to say, okay, first bring the power back to 1,500 RPM. Now pitch up, hold the altitude. All right, we're below 110 knots. Bring the, he's not going to do that. He's just going to say, all right, we're going to start off with some slow flight, and you're going to go into it by yourself. So he's not going to walk you through those maneuvers, but you're not going to sit there in silence either. You want to treat them actually as more so your first passenger, as you're going to be the PIC for the flight. So if there's some situation, don't be afraid to ask him or her to help you look for traffic. That's always good to do. Don't be afraid to ask them to hold your charts or checklists, or if you need to get something in the back seat. I don't know if you have your followers in the back or a chart. Don't be afraid to do something like that, because they are there as a resource to help you out. And another big one here, during your flight, when you're being tested on all these different maneuvers, do not rush. Take your time, all right? So when your examiner is going to say, okay, it's time to do steep turns, that does not mean he's going to expect you to start steep turns immediately. Get set up and configured as you've been trained to do so. Get that airplane configured. Do your clearing turns, get the attitude and power exactly where you need to be, do your checklist, and then go into it. So again, don't rush. This is another common place where people will fail their check rides. If, maybe they say, okay, steep turns, and they go into it right away without doing their clearing turns. Or maybe they're at 75 knots where they should be at 99 VA, for example. So again, make sure that you do everything as trained. Take your time to get set up. But that doesn't mean either that you're, not feeling too great about your steep turns. You're taking 5 minutes to get that set up. Doesn't work either. Just be efficient, basically. And don't expect your flight to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. Your check ride performance will probably not be your best flying ever. And that's okay. And the examiner knows that as well. So small mistakes. Let's say, for example, on those steep turns, we'll go with that again. We know that the standards are plus or minus 100 feet. So you can't go 100 feet higher or 100 feet lower than your entry altitude there. Let's say, you roll into the left turn, and when you're going into it, you accidentally go about 130 feet too low, but immediately you're able to get it back up and go back into the standards. That's okay. The DP is not looking for exact perfection, even though, as we talk about, they're really looking just for safety. That's going to be the key here. So something like that, a very small mistake, they will usually let it slide if you can catch it quickly and explain. But again, if you go up briefly to 130 feet, and you go to 100, 200, you go to 300, that's not going to cut it. You've got to immediately catch these small little deviations, and then you can correct for and explain. That's okay there. Or say, for example, you're transitioning between the maneuver. He asks you to hold an entry altitude of 2,500, and briefly you hit 2,600. That's okay. Just say, I'm too high, I'm correcting now to 2,500 feet. Something like that is okay as well. Another big topic here, ForeFlight and iPad during the check ride. So if we remember, when we were looking at that practical test checklist of all the different things to bring, when it said current aeronautical charts, it said printed or electronic. So from that, it is okay to use Preflight or an iPad during the check ride. I would definitely at least double check with the examiner before you test it to see if he or she is good with that. But usually what they'll have you do, at least in my experience when I've used the iPad on the check ride, is they tell me to turn the location off. So I don't know exactly where I am on the map, but I still have my section. I have the airport information on Preflight, easy to access. That's good, and that's probably what you're going to have to do there. But if you're going to use the electronics there on the check ride, do make sure you have some kind of backup. Bring those paper charts to have with you, maybe in the back. Have power banks or chargers, even Preflight on a second device, something like that, in case something goes wrong. Who knows? Maybe for an emergency scenario, the examiner will say, "Oh, iPad died. What are you going to do now?" For example. So be prepared for something like that to happen if you are going to plan to use Preflight. So going back to discontinuous this time, right? So if you finish the oral exam, you check the METAR, not looking too good, and you don't want to go flying right now, do not go flying. Just because it's your check ride date does not mean you have to go fly and finish the check ride. Show the examiner that you can actually make smart decisions and you are capable of acting as PIC. During that oral exam, you're going to go over your personal minimums. If your personal minimum, you say to the examiner, I'm not going to go flying if there's over 8 knots of crosswind component. And then after the oral, you do your crosswind component calculation according to the METAR, and it's 10 knots crosswind, and you go flying, probably going to fail right there because you're just going, again, directly against those personal minimums. So do make sure that you're able to stick to good conditions, make smart decisions there. That's very important. And if you don't pass the check run on the first try, that's okay too. It's not a big deal. So again, let's say you mess up those steep turns, you go a little bit too low and they are out of ACS standards. That's all right. So the examiner is going to tell you right away that, okay, those steep turns weren't in standards. So unfortunately, we're not going to pass today. But they're probably going to say, do you want to stop, go back to the airport, or do you want to continue and finish the rest of those maneuvers and landings? I'd probably want to continue, just get out of the way. And if you pass on all that, you're good. What you would have to do then, you would meet back with your flight instructor, retrain in those specific deficient areas. So if he only feels on the steep turns, just got to go up and do a couple steep turns until you're there back, nice and proficient, maybe just an hour of flight time. And then you would, reschedule that check ride again with the examiner. You would retest within 60 days, and you would only have to fly at those deficient areas. So you'd go up, you do one steep turn, you're good, you come back and land, point far in the Hobbs, you get your private pilot cert. It's not a big deal. It really is not if you mess up on something small like that. So don't be worried if something like that happens. And I'll end on this note over here. The most important thing is to be confident in yourself. Leading up to the check ride, again, you're going to feel it's a lot of stuff to know. And it's not the easiest thing, all the knowledge and the flight maneuvers. But do remember, your instructor will not sign you off if he or she does not feel you're ready. So if you're really down to yourself, but your instructor sign you off, you're fine. Don't even worry about it. Just remember that I am safe. Take it easy the day before. Don't study. That's what I'd usually do. And just be confident in yourself, and your performance is going to be all good on the check ride there. All right. So that's actually all I have for you guys with this presentation. So we can open it up now for any questions and kind of an open discussion, anything related to check rides and practical test prep.
Wesley, I have one question.
So, okay. All right. Excellent.
So you said, and I didn't know, I heard this. So we may have to fly somewhere else to start our check ride?
Yeah, so that's actually a great point to bring up. Some examiners are not going to come to Princeton to do that. So if we ask, I think they have at the front desk a list of 4 examiners that we usually use. Jay, he will come to Princeton. John Beck, he's based out of Princeton. So those 2 guys, you'll do it at Princeton. But the other 2, Bill Wheaton and Greg Hill, they do all of their check rides usually out of MJX, that's Ocean County Airport. So if you're going to take with them, what I would recommend is at least fly with your instructor to that airport, get familiar with the runways, taxiways, patterns, know the area a little bit. And on the day of the check ride, your instructor will endorse you to go solo to that airport usually, so you can do the check ride there. Yeah, a little bit different. But yeah, that is something that's I do that for all my check rides, actually. Private, instrument, commercial, I did them all at Ocean County. And then for my CFI, I did it with Jay at Princeton. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Who decides which whom you do your checkride?
Good question as well. So technically, all these DPEs are supposed to use that Airmen certification standards, the ACS, to evaluate, and they're the standards that they use, and they will evaluate by that. But just kind of by word of mouth, I guess, and talking to different people, you'll find some DPEs are, I don't know about more relaxed, but you just get to know them a little bit better. Again, just like knowing that Jay will come to Princeton. He doesn't. I don't have that on a sheet, but getting contact with them, you'll know. But again, the 4 that we have on the little sheet at the front desk, all pretty solid, and we all have taken check rides with them. But again, yeah, next webinar next month, John Beck is going to be hosting that, and he's going to be talking about the outline of a practical test. I'm definitely tuning into that because he's actually a DPE, and watching that will be super, super useful. So that'll be very good.
Okay, thank you, Wes.
You guys, John, of course, thank you for tuning in. Anybody here have taken a check ride or is getting ready right now?
I have to do my mock check right first.
Right, yeah, that's exactly it. Mm-hmm.
For that part.
Good. Yeah, it's definitely an important part of it as well. Definitely try to do an oral in flight with a different instructor too, just kind of ask the mock check ride. How about you, Jack? You've taken a check ride before. Any tips or tricks for us?
Yeah, so I'll say based off my sister just had her check ride a couple of weeks ago, and I had my check ride a few years ago. The information's all the same, and it doesn't really. I mean, obviously there are some standards and stuff that do change. I would say, like, you're not going to go for your check ride until you are confident that you're going to do well. So, I mean, obviously be prepared, and not to say don't be stressed, but be confident in yourself. When you're going out there, don't be, if he asks you a question, if you don't know, tell him you don't know. If you're not sure, I mean, what they always told me is if you don't know, at least express that you know where to find the answer to the question, right?
Exactly right there. Yeah, I mean, they're going to ask questions that you don't know. I had someone take a check ride recently, and she came back to me and said, on the world, the examiner asked me what RAIM was. I'm like, really? That's not something as a private pilot. I have no clue what that is. And you tell them, I don't know what that is, but you know where to find it. So yeah, that's going to be important there.
Definitely. Is anybody exceptionally close to taking their check ride? Andrew, you're on the mock check ride coming up, right?
Coming up for that, yeah.
Do you have any concerns or anything that you have to check off other than like those couple of solo or less than an hour of solo time?
No, I did everything else. The one area, and Wesley talked about it, I haven't looked at the airplane logbooks and that aircraft and engine log, so I want to do that soon so I can see what's in those and get familiar with the content of the books to be able to go through the Aviated checklist.
Yeah, the logbooks Definitely, like the first time you sit down to look at them, like Wes was saying, they're like, oh, like I know things are supposed to be here, but it's not like a typical book that you're reading or anything like that. And I mean, all the instructors are more than capable and competent, but if whoever you're trying to look to and talk to isn't around, you can talk to one of the guys behind the counter, myself.
Right.
We're happy to help out with that sort of stuff because they can definitely be a little intimidating, a little over-consuming.
For sure. Yeah, definitely get familiar with those before. And I think 8 Mike Tries logs still have my tabs there when I was doing my check ride. I guess I didn't take those out.
Good.
One of my students was doing it. I was like, okay, there you go. So may just have to move them around for like a different 100-hour, but everything else probably the same there.
So one thing on the AD part of, knowing, how do you know what ADs are actually valid? How do you find the ADs to look in the aircraft logbook?
So I'll say, and I think Jack will probably elaborate more. So I think legally we're required to keep this AD compliance notes or record in the log. So it'll list exactly what has to be complied with. I think you can also look it up on the FAA online. Somehow there's like a list of all ADs that are applicable to Cessna 172 and this serial number or whatever. So you can look it up that way. Maybe Jack has more insight on this. What do you think?
Yeah, no, Wes pretty much nailed it on the head. So the FAA will come out with a big list, and we have a subscription where they'll send it out. I forget exactly how often, but it's more frequent than you would expect. And it's, every model and make of this from serial number X to Y, like if you're at this many hours or whatever, you have to complete it. So whenever the maintenance shop is going through and doing the 100-hour inspections or the annual inspections, part of what we do is go through the AD compliance sheet and make sure that everything that does apply is complied with. It can be a little different. Like some airplanes depend if it's being used as a flight school plane, certain ADs apply and other ones don't. But we've got your back. We make sure that all of that stuff is taken care of, and you just have to go in and know where they are.
There you go. That's a good point. Exactly. If you're applying for that private, just be able to say, okay, here's that AD compliance record. It's good enough.
Okay.
How far out do you recommend scheduling it when you're ready? 1 week, 2 weeks?
That's a good question here. It's something I didn't bring up. A lot of these DPEs, their availability is tough. I recently had a student, Tion, actually. He was trying to book his check ride for a while. He passed his mock check ride with me. I'm trying to think here, maybe the beginning of August, and he was struggling to find a date for a while, and he was able to take his check ride mid-September. So it was about a month and a half gap in there, and he had to restudy some stuff, which was expected there. I would honestly just reach out to all the DPEs, see who has the most availability or quickest, and try to get it done, because again, that stuff will fade if you don't at least rehearse it after the mock check ride. But I wouldn't schedule it until you pass the mock check ride either, because there may be some things that you're not like super confident or getting totally to the standards. You don't want to rush to get that the last second. So pass the mock check ride first, reach out to all those guys and see who has the most availability. But Bill Wheaton, Greg Hill, pretty booked up usually at MJX. So Jay and John Beck, both at Princeton, good choices there.
So you said it takes about 5 hours. So do you normally start them, say, around 9, 10 a.m.? Is that the typical time you would book to start?
Yeah, so at least for John Beck, what I've noticed, starting somewhere 9 or 10, 2 hour-ish roll, and then you go fly for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Yeah, that's usually about right. I think when I did mine out of Ocean County, I started at 10 or 11. Yeah, usually it's just kind of the same thing, and I had a break for lunch, which was good. Oh, and also, if you haven't taken your written exam yet, do well on the written, because if you walk into the oral 95 on the written, probably going to be pretty easy going there. He's going to give you some leeway. So definitely would recommend a pretty good score on that. It's all about making that good impression again. Well, secret is usually in the first 10 or 15 minutes in that oral, they get to know you. They know, just kind of tell what kind of pilot you are. They'll know if they're going to pass you or not. So just make that good first impression.
All right, cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We really appreciate you joining Wesley and his wisdom. Hope everyone had a good time and learned something. If you guys have any suggestions for topics or themes you'd like to talk to us, like us to talk to you about, give us a shout, call us up, send us an email or something. As Wes has said, next month we've got John Beck, and that'll really get into the nitty gritty of the what to expect on the check ride. So, we're looking forward to getting you guys out there, getting you flying on your own.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
All right. Good to see you guys. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Take care,
Of
everyone.
course. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, Wes.
You got it.
Thanks again.
Have a good
Wes.
night. Of course. Take care.